Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the Mental Healthy Podcast. I'm glad to have you with us here today. I've got a great guest with me here today, Dr. Rob Moore, and not just Dr. Rob Moore, Dr. Rob Moore, 2 doctorate degrees. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Dean Knapp. I appreciate the invitation and opportunity to talk with you today about something that's very close to my heart.
Well, absolutely. I appreciate you being here. I'm familiar with you, but the listeners might not be. So could you give a little introduction to yourself and maybe where you are and the kind of work you do and all that?
Yeah. I've got about 40 years of post graduate school clinical experience. Mixed in there has been some initially some adjunct teaching. Actually, with Liberty was my very first gig in that area because Dr. Falwell went to one of the AACC conferences and said he needed folks, and so I applied and was adjunct for several years, and then COVID hit, and I thought, well, this is a great time to apply for full time. So I've been in full time at Liberty since 2000, and so but I continue to do some part time clinical work, and I'm glad I get to share what that's about in a little while.
Well, I appreciate it. And what part of the country are you from?
I'm originally from Chesapeake, Virginia, probably about 3 or 4 hours southeast of Lynchburg there. But right this moment, I'm in North Alabama, not real far from Huntsville, not real far from Nashville. So if that kind of gives you a geographical idea. So, yeah.
That's a beautiful part of the country.
Yes, if it's not been hit by a tornado, which, we have our fair share of them, that's for sure. But it is beautiful. The Tennessee Valley is well worth seeing, just to get a glimpse of it. Yep.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great intro. You've got some really neat expertise. So let's go ahead and dive into it. I understand that you've developed an assessment tools that determine a person's homicidal threat and homicide risk after they make a threat before they attempt a homicide. Give us a little background on that. What was your motivation or impetus, like, and the history of how you got into that kind of work?
Yeah. It's been a long journey, and I'll try to just bullet point it as quickly as possible, because it's kind of a recipe for how I got here. With as you know, in some of your first clinical experiences, you work with the peak folks that other people don't want to, and juvenile delinquents was a particular area that you could get an easy placement in. So I started very early on working with incarcerated adolescents over in Chattanooga. And then after that, I actually worked and lived with in a therapeutic group home for level 2 offenders. And that was a very valuable experience, living with them. Now, it's one thing to see them for 45 or 50 minutes, but then to live with them 24 hours a day, you really collect a lot of that. And during that time, I was working on my master's degree and then later my doctorate. And with the master's degree, I started looking back, and I realized my life has really focused a lot on prevention, because the very first project I did was trying to help kids figure out a way that teachers can early identify kids at risk for learning disabilities. So I created a test and ran that, and it was very predictive. And then I went from that to looking at moral development and antisocial attitudes in incarcerated adolescents, and then I've consulted with the Department of Corrections, Department of Youth Development, and really, got to see kind of that. So it's an amalgam of all this time spent with kids that are just having a tough time, from horrible backgrounds, but yet we have to call it what it is, that they are, some of them are dangerous. And you do have to take precautions to properly assess, properly treat. And and then what happened next was I was doing some consulting in some schools with learning disabled and emotionally disturbed children and adolescents when I got in my car and heard that there had been a school shooting. And it was only about 12 miles from where I was. In fact, it was one of the schools that actually did consulting. I was not in the school the day that happened, but I was only about 12 miles away at another school. And so, and that really, will impact you when you realize that, those kind of events occur. And this was pre-Columbine. So this was even, before, that what happened in Littleton. And so it was one of Tennessee's very first one where there was multiple fatalities. And so it was after that I was asked to develop a protocol, an evaluation protocol, because we're talking late 90s, and our technology and research was way behind. And then we start to see the school shootings really start to proliferate after that. So everybody's kind of scrambling. And so I developed a tool that would help equip my clinical practice in telling the schools which kids are the most risky, which ones are an actual threat versus those who, just need extra services that although they made the threat, they're not categorized as a high level threat, because what they're doing, they're just basically suspending these kids. They're not doing anything with them. And then after the suspension's over, they're coming back in and they're dangerous. And that just recently happened in Nashville, if you're aware that there was a school shooting in Nashville. And it was a very classic case of a kid who was on the radar. There was not, in my opinion, proper assessment and intervention, and he wound up carrying out a fatal school shooting. And so so that's kind of that history, behind how I got from, 40 years ago, just working with troubled adolescents all the way to us actually assessing them for the potential for being a school shooter. But it's that in-between period between when they make the threat and before they carry it out. And that's kind of been my wheelhouse, is not just working with adolescents in general, although that has been part of my life, but with this threat risk assessment process that I do, it's more about what do you do with them after they've made the threat, but they haven't attempted it yet. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I can appreciate what you're talking about, because we've both been around long enough to remember, 25, 30 years ago when all those school shootings were happening. And like you mentioned, Columbine was really caught the nation's attention. So you mentioned a number of keywords in there. You mentioned threat and risk. What's the difference between threat and risk anyway?
Yeah, yeah. In clinical terms, it can be a little harder to understand, but I think if we use like medical, illustrations, I think that really helps. And when I speak at like at a conference or do a workshop or something, this is one of the things that I use, is that think of like a threat, like you're a threat for having a heart attack. All your indicators are just elevated. You're in crisis at that moment. Think that way. Whereas risk is it may involve threat, because you have to evaluate these would-be shooters on both levels. How likely are they in the next, let's say, 72 hours going to carry out their threat? And that's the threat part. Well, if you determine they're not a imminent threat, then, but you can also find that they are a risk. And so that's why when I talk about, like, think about a risk for a heart attack versus a threat of a heart attack. Threat is you need to get to the emergency room. Risk is you need to change some things in your life, or you've got the indicators that would put you potentially at a level of threat. So, yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. I know people just talk about all these things as if everything is synonymous, but I can tell if you're going to do research on it like you do, there's some differences. Now, I remember when all the Columbine shootings happened and other things like that, everyone was all over the place saying it's because of this, that, whatever. But you study it from a real research perspective. So, well, what are some of the components you look at when you're trying to do a threat or risk assessment of some kind? Like what do you look at?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that at the time they were looking at was, do they wear trench coats to school? Do they, are they secretive? And, after I started spending time with these would-be shooters, I started to find a pattern started to emerge. And because I required, and we had the leverage because these kids were temporarily expelled and they had to have this threat, or they still do because I do it on call. They still
Uh-huh.
have to have this threat and risk assessment, as I require that the parents must be involved because when we look at the Oxford High School shooting up in Michigan, we know that it can be a mitigator or an exacerbator based on where the parents are. And that was a situation where the parents made the situation worse, and they actually got criminally charged. And so the involving the parents, they're a very good source of data. But it's a little bit complicated because if their child is being charged with an offense or a crime, depending on their age, and they might have been advised by an attorney to not speak about any component of, the threat that their kid levied. And so it can be a bit rough riding, but I talk to them more parent to parent, and I try to put them at ease and say, if I knew my child was in trouble, I'd want to do everything I could. And so the questions and the tool that I'm going to use with you is not to trap you. It's not to do anything other than to give you some direction. But I need data, from you. I need, this child better than anybody. And so I try to set them at ease. So there's a clinical interview of the student. There's an interview with the parent. And I have two or more teachers in that student's life complete the same tool that the parents complete, and that way I can kind of compare them at that point to see who's seeing what. And sometimes they'll see the same thing, sometimes they see a little bit different. And this is maybe a little earlier than maybe talking about. I don't know how much we'll want to talk about the nerdy stats part. But I started just to notice, but in practical terms, the parents tended to really underrate their children, and the teachers, well, either the teachers overrated them or the kids, but there was a significant difference. And there are 57 items. The average would be like 11 for the parents. It would be like 17 for the teachers. It may be they're just seeing different perspectives of the elephant. I don't know, but both pieces of information were very very important. So since I developed that in the early 2000s, I've conducted more than 300 of these evaluations, and that's when you spend that kind of time with the parents and with the kids and get the data from the teacher, you can really get a sense. But it was always just a clinical instrument, and I thought, well, if I ever get the opportunity, I want to look at what is the science behind it, if any. It might just be something that may or may not have any utility. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel the need to say something too to our listeners. There may be people listening now going, wow, this is so cool, Dr. Moore. I love what you're doing, and this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually did my dissertation on youth violence as well. And I remember one of the things we ran into at the time was that sometimes when you're doing research on this topic, some of the information you want to know to do your research is, HIPAA information or FERPA, limited. And so you can't really get the information you want. But it sounds like you were, I don't want to say the fox in the hen house, but like you were called in by the school district to do investigations and threat assessments. So you had a greater level of access to some information than maybe the public might have. Is that true?
That is absolutely true, because I just had to have a very earnest conversation with the school system, and post after that area shooting, people were pretty willing to probably to take it a little farther say, well, HIPAA and FERPA, are great, but protection of the community, just goes a little beyond that. And so I was able to broker with them a consent form. So the way we worked it out to preserve people's capacity of choice, so that, we don't diminish their rights, is that they could either have the evaluation with me, under these conditions, or they could seek a private evaluation, or they could go ahead with the 1-year expulsion, because by that time the Tennessee legislatures had sped up passing legislation that if you make a threat, you're out for a year, and the only option is to have a psychologist or psychiatrist evaluate you and say that you are not a threat and can re-enter school, at that point. So I created a consent form telling the parents that what I did and what I didn't do, that I was not a part of an investigation, that their confidentiality was only partially protected. So I tried to take every measure that I knew to be in deference to their rights and choices and privacy and protection, but at the same time balance that out with the protection of the greater community, i.e. the school. And so, yeah,
that all makes a lot of sense. So I heard you saying a second ago, though, that on the assessment that you were doing, where they rated the threat level, the parents were saying like an 11, teachers were saying like a 17. What were some of your next steps in developing the psychometric properties of the instrument you were creating?
Yeah, like I was saying, it has 57 items, so it's just a simple total. You just simply total, and it's items such as harms animals, does not take responsibility for self, has been in 5 or more fights, has made non-lethal threats. It's just basically the things that we know from 2 ways. I looked in the Department of Justice, the juvenile division, what was available. And I was doing research, Dr. Knapp, at a time when it was dial-up. And so you know how long it takes graphics, and I don't know if you're old enough to remember the slow download of the graphics, and it was just a merciless process to try to get information. Or you could go to the stacks of journals at the local, university library. It was just a slog to get data and get information. But I was able to cobble together enough of what did we know, and then I combined it with what we're not talking about. And that's what I've sometimes referred to as the secret sauce. It isn't so much about what they are doing, it's what they're not doing. And that's why I have a section in there called protective factors. And I found that they had very few protective factors that would mitigate the seriousness of their claim. And so I thought when I got hired at Liberty, I had access to an IRB. And maybe I did as an adjunct, but it didn't. But it all kind of converged together. And there's when you're a professor, that there is a community and culture that you're doing scholarly work. And I thought, well, this would be a great chance. This is a great opportunity to look at the psychometric properties of the instruments that I had created. So I made application, went through the process that you go through with the IRB. And started getting, the first thing I wanted to do was, what do other people who do this, do threat assessment, what do they think about the items and about the tools? And so it took a little while to try to get more than 324 professional counselors, psychologists across the U.S. to take the time, and I get that. But instead of using a method where you get 6 to 8 people in a room and you go through it, which is a type of the content validity, like an Oracle kind of where you're going through every item and your thumbs up, thumbs down kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, instead of doing that, I want to get up. I'm going to go for the bigness. So I wanted to have people all over the U.S. Rate it, as to how important is this item in detection of the likelihood that adolescent would carry through with a threat. And so what came back was, oh my, the reliability was 0.96. It had solid construct validity. Well, the content validity was established because it was given overwhelming. It was on a scale of 1 to 5, and every item had a mean score of 3.0 or higher. So that's where I didn't personally feel validated, but I felt that the instrument was measuring what is concerning to other people, and there were text boxes to put in there. What did I miss? What else do you think should be when you're looking at a threat assessment? And picked up a few things there and made some tweaks, but overall, it started to really come together. I had an outside consultant at University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, who is big into stats, and he's a counselor educator, and he looked at it for me and sent it back, and the results matched. So I knew that there was some integrity to the analysis itself, and so. But I was really excited to see where it went, and I'm now in a phase where I'm expanding it all the way up to age 30, because my original focus was 12 to 18. They're in school, they're there. But we also know that young adults, the other Nashville shooting that happened about a year and a half ago was actually by a student that previously attended there, but the person was in their 20s, with that particular school shooting. So, so I'm in a phase of also expanding it, but it's been nice to see that the items have been confirmed by your peers and colleagues. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, this is exciting. I mean, I'm glad to see your research, but I know as I've read about this over the years, that there's so much national interest in it. Everyone says, yes, we need to assess this and all that. But it seems to me like it's been slow, like law enforcement, educators, people seem very cautious or something to really, come to any kind of conclusions. Why do you think it's taken so long for everyone to be willing to say, why they think people act the way they do?
Yeah, I think there's a host of reasons, and I won't go into great detail other than to hit the highlights. I
Sure.
think there's a shame aspect to it. That when your kid gets on one of the social media and makes a claim of harm, they're in a small community many times. The child is ostracized. The family many times is ostracized, and so, it's hard collecting, just really good information from those folks. I think that we're in the very early stages of finally trying to recognize this. I hope it goes the way that suicide awareness went. Starting 20-ish years ago, it was something that people didn't want to talk about. It was like cancer. They kind of said it under their breath when they say, well, how did they die? And they would very cautiously say, well, they committed suicide. Whereas now it doesn't take a whole lot of time on a Google search to find where there's a suicide awareness march or a suicide awareness week at a high school. But when's the last time you heard about a march for homicide awareness? Or you'll see some victim advocacy groups, but that's the post part. They've had family members who have been victimized, but they haven't. But nobody's looking at it in this precursor, this before it happens kind of perspective. And so the other thing, Dr. Knapp, is that I've called it different things, but it's basically slumber. After an event happens, it gets everybody's attention. And I mentioned off camera that a TV reporter had contacted me, and I couldn't give him enough information. He just kept wanting interview after interview, but 72 hours, that's what the line seems to be. After 72 hours, nobody is focused on it anymore. It's like everybody goes back into their psychological slumber. They forget about it. Now, the local communities where it happened, it may go on for another week and a half, but the general public just it flushes it out of their mind. And that's why it's been so hard to collect data. I've had over 1,000 people complete the survey. But it is I have, and it sounds a bit opportunistic, but people get motivated when it's happening or when it's just happened, but on the in-betweens, my goodness, I can't hardly pay people to complete, the research surveys. And so there's that, the public seems to be intensely focused when it's happening or around it shortly after it, but then they become completely disengaged. And law enforcement and lawmakers, especially in certain states, they want to focus on gun control. They want to focus on hardware security, staff members carrying guns. And this is not at all, I don't want to, I've never wanted to go in a political direction, but really, I mean, and they can handle that part of it. Mine is that I want it to be there's this window of opportunity that we have that we're completely ignoring. The signs are there, the warning signs are there. That's where you can save the gun discussion, the hardware security. You can save a lot of that, although that is probably still needed. You could, but you have an intervention point early on that we're just not putting enough resource and time into. So I think that's what we see why this has been slow to become a routine part, an accepted part of culture. Every high school needs to have a culture. If you hear something, say something. You'll save a life. And that they're there. My wife is a former school counselor, and that had got to that point where if a friend knew somebody was suicidal, they would tell her. However, it's just not there yet with if they feel like somebody's dangerous, about reporting that. And, and then it becomes, does it violate their individual rights? Is it a witch hunt? So there are some complexities to it that I think contribute to the slowness of us. So I really think it comes down a lot to we don't know what to do and we fall asleep, and so.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you were talking about that, how people sort of get into a slumber, it seems to me that like we have so much media thrown at us in this culture, the information age, that we just get fatigue from hearing so much. And
Absolutely.
Then it almost is, I hate to sound callous, but it's almost like noise, just more news reporting. There's been another shooting here, there, and you care, but there's so often that it's sort of got numb to it. But anyway, now I know here at Liberty, we both work here at Liberty University. We know the training students get on like suicide prevention and all that. But now you work at Liberty, but you also do all kinds of national consulting on this topic. So what level of threat assessment or assessing harm do you find that students get in graduate programs around the country? Do they know anything about it or not really?
They do. There is a small body of literature that has asked that question of counselor educators specifically. Do you teach this anywhere in your curriculum? And there was quite a bit of no to that, but they would defer it and say, well, they get training when they get to their practicum and internship by their site supervisors. We definitely haven't. It was a resounding yes about the suicide awareness and training, but not about the homicide. Well, the follow-up question with the counselor educators was, why not? And the most common, if I remember the study correctly, is they didn't receive it themselves. That was number one. Number two, they did not have the clinical experience to feel like they could, be like a subject matter expert to help move that forward. And so, yeah, and so that I think that's a gap, and I don't think it has to be an extensive training. I just think it has to be something that's aware. And unfortunately, a student that I had at another university, it didn't happen when she was a student. She was a postmaster's. She was doing her postmaster's hours. A person walked in and did shoot and kill her after hours. And so that's one of the big things when I work with my interns. I'll say, never, ever, be in a clinic alone and be very cautious, being there after 7, 8 o'clock, just, and I'll tell them, just, you've got to be aware, because not all of these folks, but there's a portion of these folks that have been in therapy at some point. And I think equipping counselors in training, psychologists in training, that you're not just seeing people who are depressed, but you're seeing people who can become radicalized toward homicide, that can become hopeless and feel like, their lives and other people's lives are meaningless. and systematically go to that. And just that awareness that there's a process to watch for, and there are certain warning signs to watch for, just like we would with suicide. They do have some overlap, but there are some distinct differences.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this. When I hear you talking about people who might, go shoot somebody at a work setting or something like that, I hear people in the media talk about hard targets and soft targets and all that. And some people say that anywhere there's a large group of people and there's not much security, that's a soft target. Do you think that there's homicide risk present in faith communities, whether it's like Christian colleges or churches or things like that? Like what level of homicide risk do they have?
Yeah, I don't think, from what I've looked at it, and I get this regular database from this gentleman that collects and keeps this all in an Excel spreadsheet. And to watch, I've actually kind of watched for faith-based settings. In fact, there was one in Virginia Beach, Virginia, back in the early 2000s. It was, I think, Greenbrier Christian Academy. One of the students there came in and shot and killed. He is actually one of the few surviving school shooters that is still incarcerated, which that would be a next level project for me, is to go interview these kids who, it's been 20 years. And one of the things that Maria Rondonzo Reddy found, and she was with the FBI, in interviewing some of these, they weren't just kids, they were also adults. But one of the findings were she found a difference between the adult shooters and the adolescent shooters. The adolescent shooters almost across the board were remorseful. And so that's another, whereas the adults were more hardened, they were feeling more justified. So to circle back to there, in our faith communities, some churches really serve the marginalized and the mentally ill really well. And with that comes also extra challenges to know that, if you're, if you're providing that level of care, that, periodically there's going to be somebody come into your ministry that is going to have, exceptionalities and difficulties that would portend, there's an element of danger. And I know some churches have had to deal with things such as sex offenders, coming into their congregation, and, just other levels of risk that just aren't kind of homicide related. And so, yes, I think our churches have to be, and faith communities have to be specifically aware that, what are the warning signs and how because they're not exempt is kind of where I'm going with this. Yeah.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Well, while we're talking about faith and everything and spirituality and all this, well, let me ask you, how does that fit into your research? Because I know you've developed this instrument with 57 items and all this reliability you've done on it and all that. How does religiosity and spirituality fit into homicide risk and prevention and this whole topic?
Yeah, that is definitely what I found absent. The thing with, when you think about your old Sunday school days, right? You learn certain principles. You learn love and forgiveness and hope and charity and, and selflessness. That is consistently what I find. All of those which are the opposite of that, narcissism, justification, entitlement, is what I find in a lot of these kids. And then I find out that very few of them, we're talking, I'd have to look back, but it's less than 10% have spent more than a year in any faith-based community. So they have grown up with this kind of amorality, not necessarily immorality, but an amorality of not really knowing, right and wrong. And because if you can objectify someone enough to harm them, then you don't have that, you don't have it living in you that message of love and doing unto others, and not, and just basic 10 commandments, and it seems to be void in these kids' lives that I interview. So in the protective factors portion, there are items in there that do tap as to whether they are involved in a faith-based community, and can they articulate their spirituality. I got a bit of pushback on that. What's that got to do with this? But where else I mean, with parenting, obviously, but where else do you hear messages of service to others and being kind and, taking meals over to the widow? I mean, that's just not that present a lot out of your faith-based communities. And so they don't have that exposure. So they don't have that resident style of thinking, that to kind of, in the few that I have come across, you can tell, that they are remorse. They have that understanding that what they did was reactive for some of them, and that they should have not done that. They're more than willing to make restitution. And so restitution and restoration are things that are kind of foreign to these kids and their parents. It's like, why do I have to write a letter of apology, which is usually one of my recommendations? They deserve it. They shouldn't have talked to my girlfriend or whatever the situation might have been. But I see our faith communities as being a wonderful resource for just instilling basic values, in these kids. And so that is in my tool, is that they become involved in a community, at least scouting or something, where there's principles and virtues taught. And so, and encourage them. And I don't specify a particular religion or denomination, but I think if they can join a youth group, I'll encourage that. And a lot of places they get that. They don't push back on that. But the whole thing I'm telling the parents is that these kids have got to hear positive messages to help combat those homicidal thoughts that their kids are having.
Oh, well, that's great. Now I heard you say earlier that your instrument has gone from like 12 to 18, and then you expanded it up to 30 years old. And I can tell that you're really, entrepreneurial here, and then also really from a research standpoint as well, like expanding the application and implementation of all your research on this. What are some of the next steps in this whole process for you?
Yeah. When I first developed it, and up until recently, we're talking about the last year and a half, 2 years, I just thought it would just remain a quiet clinical instrument that I was using. I would eventually pass it on and give it to other people. I did treat it as proprietary because I didn't know where it might go, and plus there was no regulations or controls over it. In other words, I didn't want people using it that were not trained and didn't have the experience. So I thought about, well, maybe I would try to sell it or something to Pearson or Western Psych, one of the test companies. When I was speaking actually at a state level conference, and a gentleman that he and I had served together on a state counseling board came up to me and said, "Hey, you need to get this word out, and I think I can help you get that out, and see if we can turn it into a marketable tool." We'll see. That's all. That's kind of he's the opposite of me. I'm give it away. Let's find a way to make everybody safe. He's more of, no, this is something that is your life work, and if we can get people trained and all of this could be, a late career option for you. And it made sense. And he says, because things aren't free, because if we do what we want to do, we have to have a marketing strategy to it. And I said, okay, I get that, because nobody can do things without resources. And that's kind of where we are. In fact, I'm going to be on the with the Tennessee legislators next Tuesday, February 18th, talking with two particular House representatives about trying to integrate this tool into the public school system. They're considering another company, but we'll just see where that goes. So that's kind of what the next steps are, is to continue developing the instrument, expanding it, collect even more data. I mean, 1,000 plus of this sounds really good, and it is good for statistics, but it really needs to be way up in the thousands. But we can't get there until people are using the instrument more than me offering them $25 Amazon gift cards to complete the survey. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Expanding research is always hard. But I tell you, I'm sure there's somebody listening today though who's going like, "Wow, this is awesome, and this is so interesting," and maybe they want to do research on this or a dissertation or something like that. If people are interested in talking to you about this, is there an email address or a website that you have about this whole topic?
Yeah, they can go to homicidezero.com, and there's a place where they can send me an email. Of course, I have my Liberty email address as well. Would you like me to give that? I don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's rlmoore7@liberty.edu, and they could drop me a line because I'm always looking for people who share a similar passion that would like to maybe take the whole project in a bit of a different direction. And or if they just want to hang out and be a part of it and gain experience, from that way, and then, so maybe run some data, collect some data. There's several possibilities that if people want to partner, or if they want to intern, or if they want to, be a part of this, that there are definitely some opportunities.
That's great. Well, once again, listeners, that website is homicidezero.com, homicidezero.com. So that's a great way to reach Dr. Moore. And I tell you, Dr. Moore, I want to respect your time and that of the listeners. So we're about to wrap it up here, but I always try to ask everyone here at the end, is there anything else on your heart or mind that you want to sort of leave with the listeners as a sort of a parting thought?
Yes, although I've kind of given some history of how I got to this point, and also the kind of the mechanics of the instrument development, it really it's always felt missional to me. Like it's a calling for me to, and as an advocate, to have safer schools. We all know somebody. We either all have kids, or we know somebody who has kids in the school, and for them to be able to go to school and know that the threat and risk potential has gone way down is a valuable thing that I think we can give our children, so they can focus on, and our teachers as well. They're many times victims that we don't focus as much on, that they can do their job, that they can feel safe, and but yet they also have tools and mechanism that if there is a troubled student, that they know what to do. So that's kind of a concluding thought. And I thought, well, that's where a lot of this come, and maybe that didn't get communicated as clearly, but it's really a passion project more than anything. So,
well, yeah, I hear your heart there, and it makes me think, if you at the end of your career can look back and go that you made teachers and kids in America safer because of your work, I bet you can sleep pretty good at night.
Yes, well, that's the hope. Yes, that's definitely, that would be very. I'd be very happy with that. Yes,
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this. Once again, everyone, homicidezero.com is the website, and I'm sure you'll find it really interesting. And thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for being on the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Dean Knapp, for having me. I really enjoyed our time. I enjoyed the prep and just engaging you with it. And I pray the best as you move forward with other podcasts.
Well, thank you so much. And listeners, that's about it for today. But join us next time here in the Mental Healthy Podcast, and we'll look forward to having you join us. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.